You said that you were both raised, that you both had a Christian marriage.
Correct.
Can I ask you what church you're from, which denomination, or?
It's the Fundamental Independent Baptist is the church that we, the pastor from that church married us.
Okay.
It's a very fundamental Christian background and doctrine.
Okay, so when you got married then, your idea of the marriage was that you were getting married for life. Mm-hmm. That, like Jesus said, that the husband shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one.
Correct.
But therefore, God has joined together, not man. God has joined together, let no man take asunder, no government take asunder. That was your idea of marriage.
Yes.
Did you speak to the pastor first?
Yes.
And can I ask you what his response was to this whole thing? Because I've been finding that not all pastors do a very good job with this.
Correct. I had mentioned it to 3 different pastors. Mm-hmm. I met my wife. We're both working in New York City, and that's where we attended the Fundamental Independent Baptist Church. Mm-hmm. It's called Heritage Baptist Church of New York City. I mentioned it to that pastor. I mentioned it to the pastor of her church in Burlington, Ontario, Canada. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned it to the pastor of the church where we were attending in Virginia. That's the first church we attended when we moved to Virginia. Mm-hmm. The pastor in Canada immediately took Clarissa's side because that was the church she grew up in. Mm-hmm. And the pastor up there turned against me. Mm-hmm. The pastor that married us out of New York City, he was indifferent. His response was, I'm not the solution for this problem. He just said a divorce is a very difficult thing. I'm not the solution for this problem. So and the pastor in Virginia where we were going when we first moved to Virginia, he turned against me because I subpoenaed him in court. And he didn't like the fact that I subpoenaed him because he told me he didn't want anything to do with it. So
did any one of the pastors or any one of the elders tell either you or your wife that divorce is sin? Especially your wife.
No, they did not.
So, and I find that this is a very big problem because in many instances, Jesus is very clear about it. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, you look at the teaching of the Bible, you look at where the Apostle Paul said that, marriage is the mystery expressing the love of Christ in the church. Mm-hmm. So it's a living symbol of the love of Christ for the church. Mm-hmm. And it's a very much of a religious liberty issue. And none of the pastors said anything, or none of the pastors really cared that much about what was taking place. Divorce is just commonplace now?
No, but they did not, and that was a shock to me.
Right.
One pastor said, I don't want to lose her, referring to my ex-wife.
Yeah.
The pastor up in Burlington, Ontario, Canada, and his response was, well, that's true, but we don't live in a perfect world. So and none of the pastors actually never stood on the biblical ground or what the Bible says about divorce. When I mentioned the problems Clarissa and I were having, right. When I mentioned to them that she filed a no-fault divorce, none of them stood on the biblical mandates on what the Bible says in regards to divorce. None of them mentioned that she's in sin. Yeah. Not any of the 3 pastors. And
that's a very important point, I think, because today, especially in North America, we look at divorce as not necessarily being a sin, and yet the Bible is very, very clear. And I say that, because the church has compromised on this issue of divorce, it's led to a lot of other compromises all the way down the line. And when the church is not standing for marriages, it's actually saying the state can insert itself into an institution, a sacrament of God, an institution of God, an ordinance by God, and we're letting the state intrude upon this religious act, this religious sacrament or ordinance or whatever you want to call it. But your testimony, what you're saying right now is, unfortunately, it's not uncommon. Mm-hmm. It's one of those things that I've been shocked at how bad the church has actually been on this issue. The church is not standing for marriage as it should. Mm-hmm.